What if history did not begin but erupted? In the south of modern-day Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers bleed into the Persian Gulf, a mystery was born from the silt and reeds. How could a people who seemingly had no past invent the future? The Sumerian king list, a strange and haunting document, speaks of rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years before a great flood wiped the slate clean. After the deluge, it says, kingship once again descended from heaven, and with it, out of the barren mudflats rose the first cities the world had ever seen. Uruk, Ur, Eridu. They did not grow slowly, organically. They appeared almost fully formed, their skylines dominated by stepped temples, their fields nourished by a perfect grid-like system of irrigation canals. It was as if they were built not from trial and error, but from a pre-existing blueprint. Who were these people, who called themselves the black-headed ones? Their language is an orphan in a world of linguistic families related to nothing spoken then or now. It is a ghost tongue, a solitary voice from the dawn of time. This sudden explosion of complexity is the foundational enigma of human civilization. In a historical blink of an eye, these black-headed people gave the world a cascade of inventions that would define human existence for the next 5 millennia. They invented the wheel, but not just for pottery. They put it on carts and chariots, shrinking the world and creating the logistics of trade and warfare. They invented the plough, turning scattered subsistence farming into organized agriculture capable of feeding thousands, freeing hands and minds for other tasks. They invented law. They invented bureaucracy. They invented the 60-second minute and the 60-minute hour we still use to measure our lives, a silent testament to their genius ticking on our wrists every day. But most profoundly, they invented writing. On humble tablets of wet clay, they began to etch the world. And in doing so, they dragged humanity from the timeless twilight of prehistory into the harsh, unforgiving light of recorded time. This was no gentle dawn. The birth of civilization was a violent, bloody affair. The fertile land, this sliver of paradise they called the Eden, was a prize to be fought for, inch by bloody inch. The new cities were not sister states in a federation of progress. They were rivals, hungry wolves circling each other, their teeth bared. The gods they worshipped were not benevolent shepherds, but capricious, terrifying forces of nature that demanded appeasement through elaborate ritual and sacrifice. The rulers who emerged were not philosopher kings, but priest kings, men who claimed to speak for the heavens while their hands were stained with the mud of the earth and the blood of their neighbors. Their power was absolute, their word was law, and their ambition was as vast as the sky they so meticulously charted. Each city was a fortress, a walled island of order in a sea of chaos. Behind the massive ramparts, a new kind of human being was being forged. No longer just a hunter or a farmer, but a citizen, a cog in a complex social machine. There were priests who placated the gods, soldiers who defended the walls, scribes who counted the grain, and a vast underclass of laborers who dug the canals and raised the temples, their lives spent in service to a communal dream they may not have fully understood. This rigid hierarchy was the price of survival. It was the innovation that allowed thousands to live together, to plan for the future, to build something greater than any single individual, but it also created a new kind of conflict, not just between cities, but within them. The eternal struggle between the powerful and the powerless had begun. The very landscape was a battleground. To control the water was to control life itself. The intricate network of canals was the circulatory system of this new civilization, but it was also its greatest vulnerability. Divert a canal upstream and you could starve a rival city into submission. Break a dike and you could drown their fields in a saline tide, poisoning the land for generations. The earliest recorded conflicts in history were not grand ideological crusades, they were brutal, desperate water wars. The famous Stele of the Vultures, a monument from the city of Lagash, depicts the king leading his phalanx of spearmen into battle against the neighboring city of Umma. It is a horrifyingly graphic record of war, vultures carrying away the severed heads of the defeated, the king himself bashing in the skull of a captive. This was the reality of the Sumerian dawn. Progress was paid for in blood. The gods were everywhere, their presence woven into the fabric of daily life. Each city had its patron deity, whose temple, or ziggurat, was the physical and spiritual heart of the community. These were not places of quiet contemplation. They were bustling economic engines, vast temple complexes that owned land, employed workers, ran workshops, and controlled trade. The priests who managed this divine enterprise were the original masters of data. They used clay tokens and later cuneiform script to track every last sheep, every jar of beer, every measure of barley that flowed into and out of the temple's storehouses. It was the birth of accounting, the mundane but essential bedrock of civilization. The gods might rule the heavens, but on earth, their power was measured in meticulously kept ledgers. What drives a species to leap from the Stone Age to the Urban Age with such terrifying speed? Was it a response to environmental pressure, a changing climate that forced people to band together and innovate or die? Or was it something deeper, a spark of consciousness that ignited in this one particular place and time? The Sumerians themselves had an answer. Their myths tell of the Abgal, 7 sages, semi-divine beings who came from the sea in the days before the Great Flood to give humanity the gifts of civilization. The me, the fundamental principles of order, law, and craft. For them, civilization was not an invention, but a revelation, a gift from the gods. But as their history would prove, a gift from the gods can often feel indistinguishable from a curse. This new world they had built was a paradox. It offered a degree of security and prosperity never before known, but it also created new anxieties, new pressures, new forms of control. The farmer was no longer at the mercy of the hunt, but he was now at the mercy of the tax collector. The individual was protected by the city walls, but also trapped by them, his life governed by the decrees of a distant priest-king. They had escaped the chaos of nature only to create the organized, far more efficient chaos of human politics. Rome built roads, the Greeks built democracy, but the Sumerians built time itself, dividing it into the hours and minutes we still use today without knowing their names. They laid the very foundations of our reality. The struggle for dominance between the cities intensified. Lagash against Umma, Uruk against Kish, Ur against them all. Alliances were forged and broken, dynasties rose and fell. The land was soaked in the blood of endless, attritional warfare. It was in this crucible of conflict that the nature of leadership began to change. The priest-king, the En or Ensi, who was once merely the chief administrator of the city god's estate, found his power growing. In times of crisis, a Lugal, literally a great man, would be chosen to lead the city's army. At first, this was a temporary position, but emergencies became perpetual. The temporary war leader became a permanent king. Power was shifting from the temple to the newly built palace. These were the first true kings in history, men who ruled not just as stewards of a god, but by their own authority, their own ambition. They were the prototypes for every pharaoh, every emperor, every tyrant to come. They began to see themselves as more than mere mortals, as something closer to the divine beings they worshipped. They were no longer content to simply serve the gods. They wanted to join them. This audacious, blasphemous ambition would unlock new heights of glory and new depths of depravity. These were not yet men who called themselves gods. That particular brand of arrogance was still to come, and it would give birth to heroes and monsters. Would you have chosen to live in this new world of order and control? Or would you have remained in the wilds, free but vulnerable? Share your thoughts. Which is the greater human achievement, the courage to build civilization from nothing, or the resilience to survive the chaos it immediately created? Let us know in the comments below. The age of the anonymous priest-king was over. The era of the hero, the demigod, The Lugal, whose name would be carved into stone and legend, had begun. In the city of Uruk, a king arose whose story would become the world's first great work of literature. His name was Gilgamesh. He was, the epic says, 2/3 god and 1/3 man, a being of terrifying strength and boundless arrogance. He was the wild bull who rampaged through his own city, taking what he wanted, sleeping with the brides of his subjects on their wedding nights, a tyrant whose appetites were as monumental as the walls he built around his kingdom. He was the ultimate expression of the new royal power, absolute, unchecked, and dangerously close to divine. The gods themselves, disturbed by his hubris, were said to have created a rival for him, the wild man Enkidu, to temper his spirit. Their clash and subsequent friendship form the heart of a story that is, in essence, a meditation on the savage nature of power and the desperate human search for meaning in the face of mortality. Gilgamesh's reign marks a crucial shift in the Sumerian psyche. The focus was no longer just on the survival of the community, but on the eternal glory of the individual ruler. The king was the state, and his legacy was paramount. This obsession with fame and the afterlife fueled monumental building projects and brutal military campaigns. Gilgamesh's quest for a mythical forest of cedars, guarded by the monster Humbaba, was not just a heroic adventure, it was an allegory for the Sumerian city-state's relentless need for resources. They had mud and reeds in abundance, but wood and stone, the materials of lasting monuments, had to be taken by force from distant lands. Every great temple, every towering ziggurat, was built upon a foundation of conquest and exploitation. The hero's journey was also the conqueror's march. The ultimate fear for these new god-kings was not defeat in battle, but oblivion, the final, irreversible reality of death. After the death of his beloved friend Enkidu, Gilgamesh is consumed by a terror of his own mortality. He abandons his kingdom and wanders the earth, seeking the secret of eternal life from Utnapishtim, the sole survivor of the Great Flood, a Sumerian Noah who was granted immortality by the gods. His quest is a failure. He finds no magic plant, no divine secret. The lesson is stark and unforgiving. For all his power, for all his divine blood, he is a man, and man must die. This existential despair, this rage against the finality of death, became a driving force of the royal court. If you could not live forever, you could at least ensure that your death was as magnificent and terrifying as your life. Nowhere is this obsession more gruesomely illustrated than in the royal tombs of Ur, discovered in the 1920s by the archaeologist Leonard Woolley. What he unearthed was not just a collection of treasures, but a scene of ritualized mass murder on an almost unimaginable scale. In the Great Death Pit, he found the remains of 74 attendants, mostly women, who had been sacrificed to accompany their master into the afterlife. They were not killed violently. Evidence suggests they walked into the tomb in their finest robes, drank poison from a cup, and simply lay down to die, arranged in neat, orderly rows. Musicians were found with their fingers still on their lyres, soldiers with their spears in hand. They were property, human decorations for a king's tomb, their lives extinguished to serve his vanity in the next world. This was the price of divine kingship. They sought eternal life, but all they perfected was the art of dying for a king. The city-states had become personality cults, each revolving around a ruler who was both a military commander and a high priest. These kings sponsored art and technology, but always in the service of their own power. They perfected metallurgy, not for better plows, but for better helmets and axes. The iconic Sumerian battle formation, the phalanx of tightly packed spearmen protected by heavy shields, was a machine designed for one purpose: to crush the armies of rival cities. Wars were no longer just skirmishes over water rights, they were total wars, aimed at the complete subjugation or annihilation of the enemy. The defeated king would be ritually humiliated, blinded, or executed. His city would be looted, its patron god carried away in chains, a symbolic act of cosmic domination. The palace intrigue must have been suffocating. With power so concentrated in one man, the court would have been a snake pit of ambition, betrayal, and paranoia. Sons plotting against fathers, brothers against brothers, high priests vying with generals for the king's ear. Every royal decision would be scrutinized, every omen interpreted and reinterpreted. The king's health, his moods, his dreams, these were matters of state security. A single sign of weakness could invite a challenge, a coup, a knife in the dark. This constant pressure, this need to project an aura of invincibility, only pushed the kings towards greater displays of piety and brutality. They had to prove, day after day, that they were worthy of the gods' favor and worthy of their subjects' terror. The hero king was a paradox. He was the protector of his people, the one who guaranteed the favor of the gods and the stability of the harvest. But he was also their greatest predator, the one who could demand their sons for his army and their daughters for his pleasure, the one who could lead them into ruinous wars for the sake of his own glory. This tension is at the heart of the Sumerian political experiment. How do you grant one man enough power to save a city without giving him enough power to destroy it? It is a question we still wrestle with today. The Sumerians' answer was to elevate him, to place him on a pedestal so high he could almost touch the heavens, hoping his divine status would make him a benevolent shepherd rather than a devouring wolf. The legends of this era, the tales of kings like Enmerkar, Lugalbanda, and Gilgamesh, are not just stories. They are political propaganda. They were composed to legitimize a dynasty, to celebrate a great victory, to justify a king's rule. They are the first drafts of history written by the victors. They present a world of clear-cut heroes and monstrous villains, of divine mandates and epic quests. But beneath the heroic veneer lies a more complex reality, a world of ruthless political calculation, of brutal resource grabs, and of men grappling with the terrifying, intoxicating burden of absolute power. This age of heroes could not last. The cult of the individual, the endless cycle of personal wars for glory, was ultimately unsustainable. It was exhausting the land and the people. A single charismatic ruler could build a mini-empire, but it would crumble upon his death, collapsing back into a collection of warring city-states. The system was too reliant on the strength and ambition of one man. Gilgamesh could defeat monsters and build great walls, but he could not conquer his own mortality. And no king, however powerful, could truly cheat death. To achieve a more lasting form of power, a more permanent kind of immortality, the kings of Sumer would need a new technology, one more powerful than the bronze axe or the chariot. They needed a way to make their will, their laws, and their names outlast their fragile human bodies. They needed to conquer time itself, and that required the magic of the written word, etched into indestructible clay. The power to command armies and build temples was fleeting. The life of a king, even a demigod like Gilgamesh, was a whisper in the wind. But what if one could command the future? What if a king's decree could bind the generations yet unborn? What if his story could be told long after his bones had turned to dust? This was the promise of the mark on clay, the invention that would change the world more than any battle or any monarch: writing. It did not begin as poetry or philosophy. It began as bookkeeping. In the bustling temple storehouses of Uruk, priests and scribes needed a way to track the endless flow of goods. How many sheep? How many sacks of grain? How many jars of beer? They started with simple pictures, pictograms, scratched onto wet clay. A drawing of a head of barley meant barley. A drawing of an ox's head meant an ox. It was practical, efficient, and revolutionary. This was more than just accounting. It was the first time that information could be stored outside the human brain. It was stable, verifiable, and permanent. A person's memory could be faulty. A clay tablet was not. This created an entirely new kind of power, the power of the archive. The temple officials who could read these tablets, who controlled the records, became the gatekeepers of truth. They knew who had paid their taxes, who owned which piece of land, who was owed a debt. Their authority was based not on brute force, but on information. And information, the Sumerians quickly discovered, was the ultimate weapon. The bureaucratic state, with its endless ledgers, receipts, and regulations, was born in these quiet, dusty temple rooms. The evolution from simple pictures to a sophisticated script was a slow but relentless process. The pictograms became more stylized, more abstract. Scribes began using a reed stylus to press wedge-shaped marks into the clay, a system we call cuneiform. Crucially, they made a conceptual leap of genius. The marks began to represent not just things, but sounds, syllables. A symbol no longer had to look like a sheep to mean a sheep. It could represent the sound of the word for sheep. With this innovation, anything that could be said could be written. The full complexity of human language could now be captured in clay. Laws, letters, treaties, prayers, poems, and even insults could be recorded, copied, and sent across vast distances. It was the birth of information warfare. To master this complex new technology required years of grueling education. Special schools called edubas, or tablet houses, were established to train a new elite class, the scribes. These were the first intellectuals, the first technocrats. They were often the sons of the wealthy and powerful. A day in the life of a student scribe was not easy. They were taught from dawn till dusk, memorizing hundreds of cuneiform signs, practicing their calligraphy on clay tablets, and being caned by their teachers for mistakes. The curriculum was rigorous, covering mathematics, botany, linguistics, and literature. The Eduba was the forge of the Sumerian ruling class, a combination of a university, a civil service academy, and an intelligence agency. They didn't just invent writing, they invented the fine print. The scribes became the indispensable right hand of power. They were the grey eminences of the palace and the temple. A king might lead the army, but it was a scribe who wrote his orders, a scribe who calculated the supplies needed, a scribe who recorded the tribute from a conquered city. They drafted the laws, wrote the peace treaties, and composed the royal inscriptions that would proclaim the king's greatness for all eternity. Their position was one of immense, albeit hidden, power. They could frame a law to their advantage. They could lose a land deed. They could alter a historical record. A clever scribe could elevate a patron or utterly destroy an enemy without ever lifting a sword. Wars were now fought not just on the battlefield, but in the archives. The creation of the world's first laws was a direct consequence of writing. An oral tradition is flexible, subject to the whims of memory and the biases of the speaker. A written law is fixed. It is stone, or in this case, baked clay. It applies to everyone, at least in theory. The law codes of kings like Urukagina of Lagash sought to curb the abuses of powerful officials, to protect the orphan and the widow, to create a sense of justice and order. But they were also instruments of social control. They defined what was acceptable and what was not. They set the punishments for everything from petty theft to murder. Writing allowed the state to extend its reach into every corner of a person's life, to regulate, to tax, and to punish with unprecedented efficiency. This revolution had a dark side. If history could be written, it could also be erased. The most terrifying punishment for a rebellious city or a usurper was not just death and destruction, but the damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. Scribes would be ordered to chisel the enemy's name from monuments, to smash their statues, to break every clay tablet that mentioned their existence. To be erased from the archive was to be erased from time itself. It was the ultimate act of political violence, to make it so that your enemy had never been born. The fear of being erased became a powerful tool for ensuring loyalty. The explosion of information was staggering. Archaeologists have unearthed hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets. The vast majority are not epic poems or royal histories. They are administrative documents, tax receipts, labor contracts, court judgments, lists of livestock. They paint a picture of a society obsessed with order, with counting and controlling every aspect of life. This was the birth of the bureaucratic monster, a machine of state that, once created, developed a life of its own. It was a system designed to create stability, but it often bred stagnation, corruption, and a suffocating lack of freedom. Every citizen was entangled in a web of written obligations, a world of clay tablets that dictated their fate. The knowledge itself became compartmentalized, secret. There were specialized vocabularies for priests, for doctors, for astronomers. This created knowledge silos where experts guarded their information jealously. The ability to read and write was a privilege, a marker of status that separated the elite from the illiterate masses. This information asymmetry gave the ruling class an almost insurmountable advantage. They could see the bigger picture, read the intelligence reports from distant cities, understand the complexities of the state budget, while the common person knew only the rhythm of the seasons and the demands of the local tax collector. This new power, the power of recorded information, was too potent to remain confined to the small, quarrelsome city-states of Sumer. The tools of control, the bureaucracy, the legal codes, the standing army, the scribal schools, were now perfected. The stage was set for someone to use these tools not just to manage a city, but to conquer a world. The Sumerians had invented the machinery of empire, but they were about to become its first victims. The man who would turn their greatest weapon against them was not a Sumerian. He was a barbarian from the north, an outsider who saw with perfect clarity how the cuneiform revolution could be used to forge a new and terrible kind of power. His name was Sargon, and he would create an empire from their dust. The intricate dance of diplomacy and warfare between the Sumerian city-states was about to be shattered by a force they could not comprehend. For centuries, they had fought each other according to a set of unwritten rules, a bloody but familiar rhythm of conflict. They were rivals, but they were part of the same culture, the same world. But now an outsider was coming. A man whose name, Sargon, meant the true king, a deeply suspicious title for someone who was, by all accounts, a usurper. His origins are shrouded in a legend he likely crafted himself. He claimed to be the son of a priestess, set adrift in a basket on the Euphrates River, much like the later story of Moses. He was a man who came from nothing, a cupbearer to the king of Kish, who seized power in a bloody coup. He was an Akkadian, a Semitic speaker from the north, viewed by the Sumerians as a provincial upstart, a barbarian. They were about to learn a fatal lesson: never underestimate a man with nothing to lose. Sargon was a military genius, but his true innovation was political. He watched the Sumerian cities exhaust themselves in petty squabbles and saw his opportunity. He did not want to be just another king of another city-state. He wanted it all. Using the very technologies the Sumerians had pioneered, he created a new kind of army. It was not a citizen militia called up for a single campaign. It was a standing professional army of 5,400 soldiers, loyal only to him, not to a city or a god. He paid them, equipped them, and used them with ruthless efficiency. He swept down from the north, conquering one Sumerian city after another. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, the ancient proud centers of civilization, fell to his northern hordes. He was, his inscriptions boast, the man who washed his weapons in the lower sea, the Persian Gulf. He had united the known world from the mountains of Iran to the shores of the Mediterranean at the point of a spear. This was the birth of empire, not just a collection of conquered territories, but a single, centrally administered state. Sargon of Akkad created the world's first multinational, multicultural empire. He broke down the ancient walls of the Sumerian cities, both literally and figuratively. He installed Akkadian governors to rule over Sumerian populations. He standardized weights, measures, and, most importantly, taxes. The wealth of the entire region now flowed to his new, magnificent capital city, Akkad, a place that has yet to be found by archaeologists, its location one of history's great remaining mysteries. Sargon's genius was to understand that an empire cannot be held by force alone. It needs a shared culture, a unifying ideology. He did not try to destroy Sumerian culture. Instead, he appropriated it. He adopted the cuneiform script for his own Akkadian language. He co-opted the Sumerian gods, merging them with their Akkadian counterparts. His most brilliant move was to appoint his own daughter, Enheduanna, as the high priestess of the moon god Nanna in the great Sumerian city of Ur. This was a masterstroke of political theatre. It placed his family at the very heart of the Sumerian religious establishment. But Enheduanna was more than just a political pawn. She was a brilliant poet, the first named author in all of human history. Her hymns to the goddess Inanna are passionate, personal, and powerful works of art that reshaped Sumerian theology to serve the new imperial ideal. But the Sumerian spirit was not so easily broken. The conquered cities chafed under Akkadian rule. They saw their wealth siphoned off to a distant capital, their kings replaced by foreign governors, their ancient traditions subverted. Sargon's reign and those of his sons were plagued by constant, bloody rebellions. The Great Rebellion, a massive uprising of nearly all the Sumerian cities, was crushed with unspeakable cruelty by Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin. Naram-Sin took his grandfather's ambition one step further. He was not content to be just a king. He declared himself a god, the god of Akkad. The famous victory stele of Naram-Sin shows him as a towering horned figure, trampling the bodies of his enemies as he ascends a mountain towards the heavens. It is the ultimate image of imperial arrogance. The Akkadian Empire was a brutal, extractive machine. Its prosperity was built on the plunder of its subjects. It established vast state-run farms worked by serfs and slaves to feed its massive army and bureaucracy. The Sumerians, who had invented the city-state to protect their freedom, now found themselves subjects in a vast slave state. The irony was bitter. Their own inventions, writing, administration, professional soldering, had been perfected and used to enslave them. The dream of order had become a nightmare of total control. This empire, the first of its kind, also created the template for its own destruction. By concentrating so much power and wealth in one place, it became a glittering prize for other peoples on the periphery. From the Zagros Mountains to the east came the Gutians, a fierce, tribal people whom the Sumerians described as a plague to the land. The highly centralized Akkadian state, for all its power, was brittle. A few key defeats in battle were enough to shatter its authority. The empire, which had seemed so invincible, collapsed with shocking speed. The Gutians swept in, sacking the capital of Akkad and plunging Mesopotamia back into a dark age of chaos and fragmentation. The fall of Akkad was a traumatic event, seared into the memory of the Mesopotamian people for centuries. The Curse of Akkad, a famous Sumerian poem, explains the disaster in theological terms. It claims that the hubristic king Naram-Sin had angered the gods by plundering the sacred temple of the chief god Enlil in the city of Nippur. In revenge, Enlil summoned the Gutians from the mountains to destroy the arrogant empire. It was a way of making sense of the senseless, of finding a divine reason for a political and military catastrophe. But the underlying lesson was clear. Power built on cruelty and arrogance is built on sand. The Sumerians were left in the ruins of someone else's ambition. They had survived, but their world was broken. The memory of their brief, brutal subjugation would haunt them. They had experienced the shock of conquest, the humiliation of occupation, and the chaos that followed the collapse of their oppressor. For a time, it seemed that the age of cities, the great Sumerian experiment, might be over. The land was ravaged, the canals were choked with silt, and the people were scattered. But the idea of Sumer was not dead. It lay dormant in the mud, waiting for a new leader to pick up the pieces, to learn from the mistakes of the past, and to attempt, one last time, to build a world of order and justice on the foundations of their shattered dreams. This new order would be built not with the spear, but with the law. The Sumerian dream of a unified, orderly world lay in ruins, shattered by the Akkadian boot and then trampled by the Gutian hordes. But in the chaos that followed the collapse of the empire, a seed of revival began to sprout. In the ancient city of Ur, a new dynasty of kings emerged, determined to restore Sumerian greatness. This period, known as the Third Dynasty of Ur, or the Sumerian Renaissance, was not a simple return to the old ways. It was a conscious, deliberate attempt to build a better, more stable, and more just society. The king who laid the foundation for this revival was Ur-Nammu. He was a brilliant general who drove the Gutians out of the land, but his greatest legacy was not military. He understood that a kingdom held together by fear would eventually crumble. He wanted to build a state held together by justice. Ur-Nammu's most revolutionary act was the creation of the world's first known comprehensive legal code. Written on a clay tablet nearly 4,000 years ago, it predates the more famous Code of Hammurabi by several centuries. It is a remarkable document. It begins with a prologue stating the king's divine mission: to establish justice in the land, to banish malediction, violence, and strife. The laws that follow are astonishingly modern in their outlook. They are not based on the brutal principle of an eye for an eye. Instead, they favor fines and compensation. If a man knocks out another man's tooth, he shall pay 2 shekels of silver. If he cuts off his foot, 10 shekels. This is a profound shift from tribal vengeance to state-adjudicated justice. The state, not the individual, now held the monopoly on punishment. The Code of Ur-Nammu sought to create a fair and predictable society. It established honest weights and measures to protect people from fraudulent merchants. It had provisions to protect the vulnerable, the widow, the orphan, the poor, from exploitation by the rich and powerful. It was an attempt to create a social contract, an understanding that everyone, from the king down to the humblest farmer, was subject to the same law. To ensure his laws were known, Ur-Nammu had them inscribed on steles and placed in the marketplaces of his cities. For the first time in history, justice was not a secret known only to priests and kings. It was public, accessible, and written in stone. Alongside this legal revolution, he began a massive building program, the centerpiece of which was the magnificent Great Ziggurat of Ur, a towering monument to his piety and power that still dominates the landscape today. His son, Shulgi, inherited this reformed kingdom and perfected it. Shulgi was a fascinating and complex ruler, a brilliant administrator, a patron of the arts, a skilled diplomat, and a ruthless autocrat. He reigned for 48 years and transformed the kingdom of Ur into the most highly centralized bureaucratic state the world had yet seen. He standardized the calendar, reorganized the army, and created a corps of civil servants to manage his sprawling empire. He was obsessed with efficiency. The archives from his reign are a testament to this obsession. We have records detailing the exact number of workers assigned to a project, the precise amount of barley allotted for their rations, and the expected mortality rate for the livestock. It was a planned economy on an unprecedented scale. Shulgi also understood the power of ideology. He completed his father's legal reforms and heavily promoted the arts and literature. He founded new scribal schools at Ur and Nippur, which became centers for the preservation and study of Sumerian literature. It was in these schools that many of the great works, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, were copied and edited into the forms we know today. Shulgi presented himself not as a brutal conqueror, but as a wise and just king, a shepherd to his people. He even deified himself during his lifetime, a move learned from the Akkadian tyrants, but he framed it as a reward for his good deeds, not as an inherent right. He was attempting to create the perfect state, a well-oiled machine where every citizen had their place and every transaction was recorded. But there is a thin line between order and oppression. The bureaucracy that Shulgi built was stifling. Every aspect of life was regulated, taxed, and monitored. A vast army of scribes and officials managed the state, and their power was immense. The potential for corruption was enormous. While the laws of Ur-Nammu were designed to protect the weak, the massive state apparatus that enforced them could easily become a tool of exploitation. Citizens were conscripted for labor on state projects, their harvests were taxed to feed the army and the temples, and their lives were dictated by the endless stream of decrees that came from the capital. The dream of a just society was slowly morphing into the reality of a perfect prison. The system was also incredibly rigid. The planned economy, with its production quotas and fixed prices, was unable to adapt to crises like droughts or floods. A bad harvest could have catastrophic consequences, as there was no flexible market system to reallocate resources. The state's obsession with control stifled innovation and individual initiative. Society began to suffocate under the weight of its own rules. The Sumerian Renaissance, which had begun with a hopeful vision of justice and renewal, was ending in the cold, efficient grip of total control. They had sought harmony and found themselves in a gilded cage. Furthermore, this inwardly focused, bureaucratic state was vulnerable to external threats. While the kings of Ur were busy perfecting their administrative systems, new groups of people were on the move. From the west came the Amorites, Semitic-speaking pastoralists who the Sumerians viewed as uncivilized barbarians. An old Sumerian text describes them dismissively as a people who know not grain, who eat uncooked meat, who have no house during their lifetime, who are not buried after they die. These barbarians were pressing on the borders of the empire, a constant, low-level threat that the highly structured Sumerian state found difficult to counter. The kings of Ur built a massive wall 170 kilometers long to keep the Amorites out, a desperate attempt to preserve their ordered world from the chaotic forces beyond. But walls are rarely a permanent solution. The internal decay was just as dangerous as the external threat. The immense cost of the bureaucracy, the army, and the endless building projects was draining the treasury. Regional governors, far from the capital, began to assert their independence. The magnificent edifice of the third dynasty of Ur was beginning to crack. The pursuit of perfect order had created a state so complex and so rigid that it was losing the ability to defend itself. The very laws meant to create stability were now contributing to its downfall as people looked for ways to escape the suffocating embrace of the state. The ultimate order they sought was not on earth, but in the heavens, and their gaze was turning towards the stars. The kings of Ur had tried to impose an absolute, rational order on their world through law and bureaucracy. But humanity has always craved more than just earthly order. It has yearned to understand its place in the cosmos, to know the future. In the quiet of the ziggurat tops, under the vast, clear Mesopotamian sky, another kind of order was being mapped, the silent, predictable dance of the heavens. Sumerian priests were the world's first true astronomers. With nothing more than the naked eye and simple sighting tools, they achieved a level of precision that is staggering even today. They meticulously tracked the movements of the sun, the moon, and the 5 visible planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. They charted the constellations and created the zodiac, a celestial map we still recognize. They could predict lunar and solar eclipses with remarkable accuracy. This was not science for the sake of science. It was a matter of life and death. Their calendar, based on the cycles of the moon, was essential for agriculture. It told them when to plant and when to harvest, when to expect the life-giving floods of the Tigris and Euphrates. Astronomy was the key to earthly prosperity. But their observations led them to a profound and dangerous belief. If the movements of the heavens were regular and predictable, and if the gods who controlled those heavens also controlled the fate of humanity, then the future itself could be read in the stars. If what happens above is reflected below, then the sky was the ultimate clay tablet on which the will of the gods was written. This was the birth of astrology, the seductive idea that our destiny is not our own. Astrology became a state science, the most important tool of governance. No king would dare to make a significant decision to launch a war, to build a temple, to get married without consulting his astrologer priests. These men became the most powerful advisors in the kingdom. They interpreted omens in the sky, a halo around the moon, the color of a planet at sunset, the path of a meteor shower. A favorable alignment could greenlight a military campaign. An unfavorable one could halt it in its tracks, no matter how strategically sound. The fate of the empire now rested not on the judgment of generals or the wisdom of kings, but on the cryptic pronouncements of men who claimed to read the minds of the gods in the entrails of a sacrificial sheep or the position of Jupiter in the night sky. This created a culture of deep-seated paranoia in the royal court. The king became a prisoner of prophecy. If the omens foretold a disaster for the kingdom that was linked to the king himself, a terrifying ritual could be enacted. A substitute king, a commoner or a prisoner, would be placed on the throne, dressed in royal robes and given all the trappings of power. The real king would go into hiding, referred to only as the farmer. The substitute was expected to absorb the evil fate intended for the monarch. After a set period, often 100 days, the substitute king would be executed, and the real king would return to his throne, cleansed of the dark prophecy. Imagine the psychological terror of living in a world where the state could pluck you from your life and sacrifice you to save a man you had never met, all because of a shadow on the moon. This reliance on divination led to catastrophic political and military decisions. A campaign might be delayed at a crucial moment because of a bad omen, allowing an enemy to regroup. Alliances might be broken based on a prophecy that a partner was untrustworthy. Vast resources might be poured into building a new temple to appease an angry god while the kingdom's defenses were neglected. The search for cosmic order had introduced a profound element of irrationality into the heart of government. The greatest knowledge the Sumerians possessed, their mastery of astronomy, had become the source of their greatest madness. The paranoia extended beyond the king. Ambitious courtiers could manipulate prophecies to their own advantage. An astrologer could discover an omen that implicated a rival, leading to their disgrace or execution. A general eager for war could bribe a priest to find favorable signs in the heavens. The interpretation of divine will became a political battlefield, a place of shadow and intrigue where accusations of treason could be cloaked in the language of piety. The court was no longer just a nest of political schemers. It had become a coven of mystics and conspirators, all vying to control the future by controlling its prediction. This obsession with the future also reflected a deep-seated anxiety. The world of the late Sumerian period was becoming increasingly unstable. The Amorite pressure on the borders was growing. The economy was stagnating under the weight of bureaucracy. The climate itself may have been changing, with increasing soil salinization leading to lower crop yields. Faced with problems they could not solve through rational means, the rulers retreated further into mysticism. It was easier to blame a failed harvest on the wrath of a god than on centuries of poor irrigation practices. It was more comforting to believe that a military defeat was preordained in the stars than to accept that it was the result of a tactical blunder. The Sumerian worldview was fundamentally fatalistic. They believed that humanity was created for one purpose: to be the slaves of the gods. Your destiny was fixed from birth. You could try to appease the gods, to understand their will through omens, but you could not change your ultimate fate. This belief, which permeated their religion and their politics, may have contributed to their civilization's decline. A culture that believes it is powerless in the face of destiny may lose the will to fight, to innovate, to adapt when faced with overwhelming challenges. Why struggle against the inevitable? The stars offered a beautiful, terrifying illusion of certainty in an uncertain world. But by surrendering their agency to the heavens, the Sumerian kings became paralyzed. They looked to the sky for answers and failed to see the very real threats gathering on their own horizon. Their knowledge of the cosmos was immense, but it gave them no wisdom. They had mapped the heavens, but they had lost their way on earth. While the priests were busy interpreting the future, ambitious merchants were creating a new kind of power, one based not on prophecy or prayer, but on profit. The quest for this new power would send Sumerian ships and caravans to the very edges of the known world, sparking a new and even more brutal kind of conflict. The magnificent civilization of Sumer, with its grand ziggurats and complex bureaucracy, had a fundamental weakness. It was a land of mud. The Fertile Crescent lacked three crucial resources needed for a true Bronze Age power: wood for building and fuel, stone for construction, and, most importantly, metals like copper and tin to forge tools and weapons. To obtain these, the Sumerians had to look outward. They became the architects of the world's first long-distance trading network, a sprawling web of connections that stretched for thousands of kilometers. This was the dawn of a globalized economy, and with it came the dawn of colonial ambition and resource wars. The great game for the world's wealth had begun. From the docks of Ur and other port cities, Sumerian sailors guided their bitumen-sealed reed boats into the Persian Gulf and beyond. Their primary trading partner was the mysterious land of Dilmun, which most scholars identify with modern-day Bahrain. Dilmun was a bustling entrepreneurial hub, a free trade zone of the ancient world. From there, Sumerian merchants traded their grain and textiles for the treasures of the East. They sailed to Magan, likely Oman, for its mountains of copper, the essential ingredient for bronze, and they undertook perilous voyages to the even more distant land of Meluha, the Indus Valley civilization in what is now Pakistan and India. From Meluha came exotic goods, carnelian beads, ivory, gold, and hardwoods. It was a trade of necessities for luxuries, a flow of resources that fueled the Sumerian war machine and decorated its temples. This was not simple bartering. The Sumerians developed sophisticated economic tools to manage this complex trade. They used silver, cast into standardized coils or rings as a universal medium of exchange, the world's first true money. They invented the concepts of credit and debt. A merchant could take out a loan from a temple or a private lender to finance a trading expedition with the promise of paying it back with interest upon his return. Clay tablets acted as legally binding contracts, letters of credit, and shipping manifests. We have tablets that record partnerships, profit-sharing agreements, and even complaints about the poor quality of copper ore delivered by a supplier. This was the birth of capitalism, complete with its risk, its reward, and its endless paperwork. A new class of people rose to prominence, the merchant adventurer. These were not nobles or priests. They were often men from humble backgrounds who amassed enormous fortunes through their courage and business acumen. They were the masters of logistics, the gatherers of intelligence, the pioneers who connected disparate cultures. They had to be navigators, linguists, diplomats, and spies. They lived in a world of calculated risks where a single, successful voyage could make them richer than a king, and a single storm or pirate attack could leave them ruined. Their loyalty was not necessarily to a city or a god, but to the bottom line. Where there is wealth, there is violence. The struggle for resources inevitably led to conflict. Control over the trade routes became a strategic imperative. A rival city-state could impose tariffs, block a caravan route, or even seize a shipment. The great powers of the day began to view the resource-rich lands of Magan and Meluha not just as trading partners, but as territories to be controlled. This led to the first colonial wars in history. Kings would launch military expeditions to secure access to a copper mine or to punish a local chieftain who had disrupted a trade route. The inscriptions of Sargon and his successors boast of their conquests in these distant lands, of the tribute they extracted and the control they exerted. The quest for profit was now backed by the power of the state. This economic expansion also had profound social consequences. It created vast new wealth, but that wealth was concentrated in the hands of a small elite, the royal family, the high priests, and the most successful merchants. The gap between the rich and the poor widened dramatically. While the merchants grew fat on the profits of international trade, the average Sumerian farmer saw little benefit. In fact, he was often worse off as the state's focus shifted from agricultural self-sufficiency to the production of exportable goods like textiles. This created social tensions that threatened the stability of the kingdom. The world was becoming smaller and more dangerous. The trade networks that brought wealth and exotic goods also brought foreign influences, new diseases, and new enemies. The Sumerians were no longer an isolated civilization in a sea of barbarians. They were now part of a complex, interconnected system, vulnerable to disruptions thousands of kilometers away. A political upheaval in the Indus Valley could cut off their supply of tin, crippling their bronze industry. A new, more aggressive power could arise and challenge their control of the sea lanes. Their success had made them powerful, but it had also made them a target. The greater the wealth, the greater the greed of others. The intricate web of trade they had woven was about to become a net that would trap and destroy them. The immense prosperity of the third dynasty of Ur was a glittering facade. The foundations of their society were being eaten away from within by bureaucracy and social inequality, and from without by the growing pressure of nomadic peoples. The civilization that had invented the city was about to be undone by the people of the steppe. The wealth they had accumulated through trade was no longer a source of strength, but a beacon that attracted predators from the desert. The final act of the Sumerian drama was about to begin, and it would be a tragedy of betrayal, invasion, and apocalyptic destruction. Are you more impressed by the Sumerian warrior who conquered for glory, or the merchant who risked everything for profit? Tell us who you think was the true empire builder in the comments. The final century of Sumerian independence was an age of anxiety. The Great Wall built to keep out the Amorites was a symbol of their fear. It was a monumental effort, but ultimately futile. You cannot wall out a demographic shift. The Amorites were not a unified army bent on conquest, at least not at first. They were a tide of desperate people, pushed from their lands by drought and seeking a better life in the fertile river valleys. They infiltrated the empire, sometimes as mercenaries in the Sumerian armies, sometimes as laborers, sometimes as raiders. They were a constant, corrosive presence, undermining the authority of the state. The Sumerian kings, weakened by their own rigid bureaucracy and internal power struggles, were unable to mount an effective response. They were trying to plug 1,000 leaks in a crumbling dam. The real death blow, however, came not from the Amorites, but from a rival state to the east, Elam, centered in modern-day Iran. The Elamites were ancient enemies of the Sumerians, and they saw the weakening of the Ur dynasty as their opportunity to strike. At the same time, the Sumerian city-states themselves, which had been forced into a union under the kings of Ur, began to reassert their independence. The governor of Isin broke away, then the governor of Larsa. The great centralized state of Shulgi was disintegrating. Betrayal became the new currency of politics. Cities formed alliances with the Amorite invaders against their Sumerian rivals. It was a chaotic, multi-sided civil war, a horrifying spectacle of a civilization tearing itself apart. The Sumerian world was collapsing under the weight of its own history. The final tragic climax came in the year 2004, before the Common Era. A combined force of Elamites and their local allies laid siege to the capital city of Ur. The city that had been the heart of the Sumerian Renaissance, the home of the great ziggurat, the center of law and learning, was now surrounded by enemies. The siege must have been horrific. Famine and disease would have been rampant within the walls. After a prolonged struggle, the city fell. The destruction that followed was an act of apocalyptic vengeance. The Elamites sacked the city, looted its treasures, burned its temples, and slaughtered a significant portion of its population. The king of Ur, Ibisin, was led away in chains to die in exile. The event was so traumatic that it inspired a new genre of literature, the city lament. The Lament for Ur is a heartbreaking poem, a long, mournful cry over the destruction of the beloved city and the abandonment of its people by the gods. The fall of Ur was the end of the Sumerians as a political entity. They would never again rule their own land. The Sumerian people were not wiped out in a single, cataclysmic event, but they ceased to exist as a distinct, independent culture. They were absorbed by the waves of Amorite and other Semitic peoples who now poured into Mesopotamia. Their language, which had been the tongue of administration and literature for a millennium, slowly died out. It was replaced by Akkadian. Within a few centuries, Sumerian became a dead language, a classical tongue studied only by priests and scholars, much like Latin in medieval Europe. The black-headed people, the inventors of civilization, had vanished from the stage of history. Why did they fall? There is no single answer. It was a perfect storm of internal decay and external pressure. A possible long-term climate change event that led to increased soil salinity and reduced agricultural output certainly played a role. Their political system, swinging between the extremes of warring city-states and suffocating centralized bureaucracy, proved unstable. Their fatalistic worldview may have robbed them of the resilience needed to face the crisis. Ultimately, their downfall was a result of their own success. They had created a wealthy, complex society that was both a tempting prize for outsiders and too rigid to adapt to changing circumstances. They were the first to face the fundamental problems of civilization: environmental degradation, social inequality, bureaucratic inertia, and the challenge of managing a multicultural state. And they were the first to fail. In the aftermath of their collapse, Mesopotamia was ruled by a series of Amorite dynasties. The most famous of these was the one founded in a previously obscure town called Babylon. The great Babylonian king Hammurabi, who would later create his own famous law code, was an Amorite. But the new masters of the land did not erase the Sumerian past. On the contrary, they revered it. They adopted Sumerian cuneiform, worshipped Sumerian gods, often giving them new Semitic names, and studied Sumerian literature in their scribal schools. The ghost of Sumer haunted every subsequent Mesopotamian civilization. The Babylonians and later the Assyrians built their own magnificent empires on a Sumerian foundation. The knowledge, the myths, the laws, the very way of thinking about the world that the Sumerians had invented became the cultural DNA of the entire Near East for the next 2,000 years. But eventually, even these successor empires crumbled. Babylon fell to the Persians to Alexander the Great. The cuneiform script was replaced by the simpler Aramaic alphabet. The old gods were forgotten. The great cities of Mesopotamia dwindled into villages and were finally abandoned, their mud brick walls melting back into the earth. For nearly 2 millennia, the Sumerians were utterly forgotten. Their name, their language, their very existence were erased from human memory. All that remained were scattered, garbled references in the Old Testament to a land called Shinar. The inventors of history had become its most profound secret, buried under meters of sand and dust, waiting. The long silence was about to be broken by a new kind of conqueror, armed not with swords but with shovels and an insatiable curiosity. The memory of Sumer had been so completely erased that when the first European explorers began to investigate the mysterious mounds of southern Iraq in the 19th century, they were not looking for Sumerians. They were looking for the Babylonians and Assyrians of the Bible. They were men like the Frenchman Paul-Émile Botta and the Englishman Austin Henry Layard, diplomat adventurers in the service of their respective empires. This was the age of high colonialism, and archaeology was not a gentle academic pursuit. It was a competitive, often destructive treasure hunt, a race between France and Britain to plunder the antiquities of the crumbling Ottoman Empire and fill the galleries of the Louvre and the British Museum. Their methods were often crude, employing hundreds of local workmen to cut massive trenches through the ancient mounds, destroying as much as they discovered. Their initial discoveries were staggering. At sites like Nineveh and Khorsabad in the north, they unearthed the palaces of the great Assyrian kings, decorated with magnificent carved reliefs of battles, lion hunts, and terrifying winged deities. They found the library of Ashurbanipal, a trove of over 30,000 cuneiform tablets, the single most important discovery in the history of Mesopotamian studies. But as they deciphered these Akkadian texts, they encountered a puzzle. The script seemed unnecessarily complex, and the texts themselves frequently referred to an even older, non-Semitic language and people. The scribes called it Lisha an Shumeri, the language of Sumer. But who were the Sumerians? No one knew. They were a ghost people, a name without a history. The search shifted south to the true heartland of Mesopotamia. At sites like Tello, the ancient city of Girsu, French excavators unearthed a series of remarkable diorite statues of a ruler named Gudea of Lagash. These were clearly not Assyrian or Babylonian in style. They were older, more refined, depicting a people with round faces and large, staring eyes. Then at the end of the 19th century, an American expedition began work at Nippur, the ancient religious center of Sumer. They uncovered the Temple of Enlil and a massive archive of thousands of tablets written in this mysterious older language. Slowly, painstakingly, scholars began to piece together the history and culture of this lost civilization. It was a stunning revelation. Before the Babylonians, before the Assyrians, there was Sumer. They were not just an older culture, they were the source. The early 20th century became the heroic age of Sumerian archaeology. Leonard Woolley's methodical and scientific excavations at captured the world's imagination, especially his discovery of the royal tombs and their spectacular, gruesome treasures. A clay fever gripped the museums of Europe and the United States of America. Everyone wanted a piece of this newly discovered foundational civilization. A black market in looted antiquities flourished. Tablets were torn from their archaeological context, their priceless information about the past scattered to the winds, sold to the highest bidder. The legacy of the world's first civilization had become a commodity, another resource to be exploited by the great powers of the modern age. The process of deciphering the Sumerian language was a monumental intellectual achievement, the work of several generations of dedicated, often eccentric, scholars. It was like cracking a code with no key. But as they began to read the tablets, a lost world came back to life. They discovered the Epic of Gilgamesh and its parallels to the biblical story of Noah's flood. They read the law codes, the temple hymns, the proverbs, and even the school exercises of children who had lived 4,000 years ago. They pieced together the names of kings, the dates of battles, the details of daily life. The Sumerians, who had been silent for millennia, began to speak again. This rediscovery had a profound impact on our understanding of history. It pushed the timeline of civilization back by thousands of years. It revealed that many of the things we credited to the Greeks, the Romans, or the Hebrews, law, literature, astronomy, monotheistic concepts, had their roots in the soil of Sumer. It was a humbling realization. The foundations of Western civilization were not laid in Athens or Jerusalem, but in Uruk and We were all, in some sense, the cultural descendants of these strange, black-headed people. But the story is far from over. The archaeological work was disrupted by the endless cycle of war and instability that has plagued modern Iraq. Countless sites remain unexcavated. During the chaos of recent decades, museums have been looted and archaeological sites have been ravaged by treasure hunters on an industrial scale. The clay tablets that have survived for 4 millennia are being destroyed at an alarming rate. It is a race against time. We are losing the history of the Sumerians faster than we can recover it. The greatest threat to their legacy is no longer the sand of the desert, but the greed and violence of their modern-day descendants. Hundreds of thousands of tablets sit in museum drawers around the world, unread, untranslated, their secrets still locked away. They are a library of a dead civilization waiting for a key. The final race to unlock the secrets of Sumer is not happening in the dusty trenches of Iraq. It is happening in the sterile labs of Silicon Valley and in the secure servers of government intelligence agencies. The sheer volume of untranslated cuneiform text is overwhelming. There are not enough scholars in the world to get through it all in 1,000 years. The new Holy Grail is the creation of an artificial intelligence, a machine learning algorithm capable of reading and translating the entire Sumerian archive instantly. Major technology corporations and university research projects are pouring millions of dollars into this effort. They feed tens of thousands of translated tablets into neural networks, training them to recognize the patterns, the grammar, the vocabulary of this long-dead language. The goal is to create a digital scribe, a virtual master of cuneiform who can read a tablet as easily as we read a newspaper. This is not just a historical curiosity. For some, it is a matter of national security. What secrets are hidden in these texts? The Sumerians meticulously documented everything. Their archives contain thousands of years of data on climate change, on the management of irrigation systems, on the economic consequences of plagues and wars. They contain detailed records of social structures, of how to manage a diverse population, of how to control information. For a modern state, this is not history, it is a treasure trove of raw data, a case study in social engineering that spans millennia. The power to instantly access and analyze this information is the power to model the past in order to predict and perhaps control the future. Imagine a world where an artificial intelligence could cross-reference every known Sumerian text. It could reconstruct the entire social and economic network of ancient Mesopotamia. It could trace the spread of ideas, the causes of social unrest, the tipping points that led to civilizational collapse. This knowledge would be priceless to an economist, a sociologist, a military strategist. The first nation to unlock this archive would gain an unimaginable strategic advantage. The race to translate Sumer is also a new kind of arms race where the weapons are algorithms and the prize is absolute information. We are repeating the mistake of the Akkadian kings, seeking to turn the wisdom of the past into an instrument of power. The project raises profound and disturbing questions. What will we do with this knowledge? The Sumerians created the tools of state control, writing, bureaucracy, surveillance, and those tools ultimately contributed to their own suffocation and collapse. Now, armed with technologies of data analysis they could not have dreamed of, we are seeking to perfect their system. Are we trying to learn from their mistakes, or are we simply trying to build a more efficient version of their prison? The Sumerian kings became paranoid prisoners of prophecies, making fatal decisions based on what they believed was a perfect knowledge of the future. Will we become prisoners of our own algorithms, surrendering our judgment to a machine that promises perfect predictive power based on the data of the past? The story of the Sumerians began with a technological explosion that catapulted them from the Stone Age to a complex urban society. Our story may be ending with a similar explosion, an information revolution that promises omniscience. The Sumerians gave us the foundations of our world, the city, the law, the wheel, the word. Their civilization rose to incredible heights of genius and fell to tragic depths of folly. Their history is a warning, a 4,000-year-old message in a bottle, written on clay. It tells us that our greatest inventions are always double-edged swords. The tools we create to bring order can also be used to create oppression. The knowledge we acquire to liberate ourselves can also be used to enslave us. They learned this lesson the hard way. The question is, have we learned it at all? The final archive of the world's first civilization is about to be opened. This time, the scribes are not human. The knowledge they unlock will give us an unprecedented view into the birth of our world, but also into its potential end. We stand on the verge of knowing everything about them. At the exact moment we seem to be repeating their trajectory. What are we truly seeking in these ancient tablets? An echo of our past, or a blueprint for our future? Tell us, what will you choose? The wisdom to understand the lessons of their fall, or the ambition to use their knowledge to build our own, perhaps final, empire? Write your answer in the comments. The future is listening.